Rise to power King Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, began his journey to power in quite an unusual way. He did not inherit just a throne. He inherited a mission, an immense responsibility that would shape his life uncontrollably. Since he was young, he had heard grand stories about victorious battles and conquests that seemed unreal. Babylon, his homeland, was an immense and unbeatable empire, and the weight of this legacy was something he had to carry with courage, although he did not know how challenging this path would be. In moments like this, it is easy to imagine that many of us, when faced with great responsibilities, feel like Nebuchadnezzar, somewhat lost and inexperienced, but with a spark of ambition and desire for success. When his father passed away, the young Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne, carrying the name and honor of a vast empire. Like many others, he felt the weight of glory in his hands. The Bible tells us in Kings 24:1 that he ascended the throne and was immediately challenged in battles against great powers like Egypt. This proved that, even as new king, his courage and skill were comparable to those of the Battle of Carchemish, a historical landmark involving Nebuchadnezzar and the Egyptian army, is a clear example of how a leader's life is not just about the throne. When he defeated Egypt, he not only consolidated his empire, but also found within himself the fierce leader he had been called to be. The victory was not only military, but also spiritual. The king, perhaps for the first time, saw that absolute power did not come only from physical strength, but from trust and something greater. He was not just the king of an empire. Unknowingly, he was being shaped to play a much more significant role in God's story. But as his power grew, so did his pride. He had everything he could wish for, and this blinded him to the true source of power that lay beyond his achievements. We learn from this. Power, when not handled with humility, can lead to arrogance. In 2 Chronicles 36:6, see how the king of Babylon became a central figure, conquering lands and exalting himself, often forgetting where his strength came from. This reminds us that, in our own lives, we might be tempted to rely solely on ourselves, forgetting that all our strength comes from God. Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power is an example of how life can be unpredictable and how responsibility, no matter how desired, comes with enormous challenges. What he did not yet know, but what God was preparing for him, was that his ascent to power was only the beginning of a transformative spiritual journey. He still had much to learn about who he was and about the divine plan that was unfolding in his life. It was as if God, silently, was preparing Nebuchadnezzar for something greater than he had ever imagined. And the journey continues, my friend. The story does not end here. Let's move on to the next chapter of Nebuchadnezzar's life, where we will see how his achievements brought him something unexpected, spiritual challenges that he was not prepared to face. Are you ready to explore this? Let's go together. Empire expansion. After his crushing victory over Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar found himself in a position of uncontested power. He was no longer just the king of Babylon, but now he was the ruler of a vast empire with lands and riches beyond imagination. But as often happens with those who reach great heights, power became something difficult to manage. With this expansion came the need to control the conquered peoples, dominate the territories, and, above all, ensure that his authority was recognized in every corner of the empire. And it is here, at this crucial point in Nebuchadnezzar's life, that he decides to focus on a small but important kingdom, Judah. He subjugates Jerusalem, plunders Solomon's temple, and deports thousands of Jews to Babylon. This event is profound, for it reveals not only the strength of Nebuchadnezzar, but also the idea that often our actions have consequences that exceed our understanding. What seemed like a simple act of conquest, a military expansion, became a moment that would impact a people's lives for generations. In Jeremiah 39:8-10, we see the lament of Jerusalem after it was destroyed, and this reminds us that the choices made by the leader of a nation have profound implications for others. The way Nebuchadnezzar dealt with Judah also teaches us an important lesson about God's sovereignty. Contrary to what he thought, his victory was not just the result of his military strength. God had a plan for his people and for history. When God allows something to happen, even when it seems difficult or unjust, he is working on something much greater than we can see. The Jews who were taken captive to Babylon would be part of a divine plan that was still to come. They were being prepared for something significant, although suffering was part of this process. Here, we can reflect on our own lives. How many times have we felt like the Jews, being carried away by circumstances beyond our control? But God never abandons. He has a greater plan for us, just as he did for his people. During this period of expansion, Nebuchadnezzar saw himself not only as a conqueror, but as someone who had the power to shape the destiny of entire peoples. However, in doing so, he was about to confront an unchangeable truth. All human power is temporary. In Isaiah 40:23-24, we see how God brings down the mighty and exalts the humble. This principle is something that Nebuchadnezzar, over time, would need to learn in the hardest way possible. What can we take from all of this? Nebuchadnezzar's empire expansion, just like our own quest for achievement, should always be done with the understanding that we are instruments in the hands of God, and that, in the end, true victory comes from his will, not from our own strength. The lesson here is clear. Power should not be used to oppress, but to fulfill the divine plan. No matter how great our empire, we must always remember that we are merely instruments of a sovereign God. And although the expansion of the empire gave Nebuchadnezzar a sense of greatness, he still did not know that his true lesson was about to be revealed. Don't worry, the story is far from over, and the best is yet to come. Shall we move on to the next chapter? The greatness of Babylon, Babylon, a city that shone at the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. When he looked at his city, he saw more than just stones and palaces. He saw the reflection of his own greatness. He had transformed Babylon into a magnificent empire, a city that would become synonymous with power, wealth, and glory. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were created for his wife, Amidus, as an expression of his love and his need to show how much he had to offer. They were not just gardens. They were symbols of his ability to conquer the world around him. However, this grandeur, this outward brilliance, reminds us that often we focus so much on our visible achievements that we forget what truly matters. In Matthew 6:19-21, Jesus warns us not to store up treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, but in heaven, where nothing can take them away. Nebuchadnezzar, with all his wealth, needed to learn a very important lesson. What he built on the outside was nothing compared to what God was building within him. His palaces, golden temples, and the hanging gardens were merely reflections of what he thought was his power. But God's true power is not visible to human eyes. It resides in our hearts. As mentors, it is important to reflect on what we are building. Often, we place our trust in material things and the titles we achieve, but we must remember that everything we build here on earth can be easily destroyed. As we see in the biblical story, Nebuchadnezzar's external grandeur was temporary. What will remain is what he built spiritually within himself and those around him. In 1 Corinthians 3:12-13, Paul talks about what we build in our lives. If it is made of gold, silver, and precious stones, it will withstand the fire, but if it is made of wood, hay, and straw, consumed. Nebuchadnezzar then begins to see himself as a being of incomparable power. He imagines that everything he has done is a reflection of his own greatness, but God, silently, was already preparing a plan to teach him a profound lesson. The truth is that when we focus solely on the external, as Nebuchadnezzar did, we forget something much greater: the importance of cultivating our soul. Pride can be a poison that corrodes the heart, and Nebuchadnezzar was about to discover this in a very harsh way. But this was not the end of his story. What comes next is the real key to understanding the journey of a king, the spiritual growth that happens in the silence of trial. Shall we explore that in the next chapter? The mysterious dream now, on a peaceful night, while Nebuchadnezzar was sleeping, something strange happened. He had a dream that deeply disturbed him. It was a vision of a huge statue made of various materials, each representing a phase of history. This dream left the king so distressed that he called all of his wise men to interpret it. But as God wanted to show Nebuchadnezzar, the answer would not come from any of the magicians or astrologers in the kingdom. The answer would come from a man of faith, the prophet Daniel. When Daniel was called to interpret the dream, He revealed a truth that, for Nebuchadnezzar, was hard to swallow. The statue, made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, represented the empires that would rise after Babylon, with each material symbolizing an era of power. The gold represented Babylon, but God's kingdom, a stone cut without hands, destroy all these empires, leaving only the eternity of his kingdom. This undoubtedly was a shock to the king, who was not used to being reminded of the fragility of his power. In Daniel 2:44, we see that the prophecy is clear. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will be destroyed. Here is the lesson. No empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. All human kingdoms are temporary, but God's kingdom is eternal. For us, this should be a constant reminder. In our daily lives, we sometimes cling too much to what is temporary. It may be our career, our social status, or our possessions. But God calls us to something eternal. As it is written in Luke 12:15, a person's life does not consist in the abundance of their possessions. For Nebuchadnezzar, this message was a warning. God was telling him that, no matter how powerful he was not the owner of history. The true king was in control of everything. Imagine the distress of Nebuchadnezzar when he realized that. A king so immense and powerful, being reminded that he was not invincible. What do you think he would do in the face of this revelation? It led him down a path of spiritual challenge that would deeply shape him. But before we get to the conclusion, let's explore a crucial moment in the king's life where his pride would be put to the test to know what comes next. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, let's leave King Nebuchadnezzar in his pursuit of understanding the dream and move on to an event of pure courage and faith. The Bible introduces us to three brave young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three men, loyal to God, refused to bow down before the golden statue erected by Nebuchadnezzar, even with the imminent threat of being thrown into the blazing furnace. They knew that the God they trusted in was more powerful than any earthly threat. In Daniel 3:17-18, we see the firmness with which they respond to the king. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and from your hand, O king, he will deliver us. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image you have set up. This response is not only an act of courage, but a declaration of faith. They were not intimidated by human power because they knew that God was in control of everything. What can we learn here? In our lives, we often face moments of pressure where we are challenged to give up our convictions to meet the expectations of others. But like these young men, we should stand firm in our faith. God never promises that we won't face difficulties, but he promises to be with us through. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not alone in the furnace. When the men looked inside, they saw a fourth man who looked like the Son of God, Daniel 3:25. This reminds us that even in the hardest times, God is by our side, ready to sustain us. Nebuchadnezzar saw with his own eyes the power of God, and this made him reconsider the way he viewed his own empire. The king's pride began to crumble, but he still had much to learn. What do you think? Are you ready to see what happened next? Let's move on to the next chapter in Nebuchadnezzar's story. Oh, and be sure to like the video if you enjoyed today's topic, and hit the notification bell to receive updates whenever we post something new, okay? Fall and redemption. Now, we come to a crucial point in the story of Nebuchadnezzar where his spiritual journey takes an unexpected turn. After so much power and success, the king began to become enamored with his accomplishments and the grandeur he had created. He looked at Babylon with its golden palaces and lush gardens and declared with great pride, "Is not this the great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" Daniel 4:30. He forgot that everything he had accomplished was made possible by the mercy and sovereignty of God. It was at this moment of arrogance that God confronted him directly. A voice from heaven was heard announcing the fall of the king. He would be banished from his throne and live like a wild for 7 years until he recognized that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. Daniel 4:32. Nebuchadnezzar's pride, so immense, was brought down instantly and humiliatingly. He found himself removed from his great city, eating grass like cattle and living like a wild beast. This was a bitter but necessary experience. God, in his mercy, needed to show the king that all human power is temporary and that, in the end, only divine sovereignty prevails. Now, imagine what this represents in our own lives. We all, in some way, cling to our achievements and our status. Sometimes we forget that it is God who gives us everything we have. As it is written in 1 Corinthians 4:7, "For whom makes you differ from another? And what you have that you did not receive?" King Nebuchadnezzar, through his fall, received a deep lesson in humility and dependence on God. He learned, the hard way, that true greatness comes from recognizing that we are merely instruments in the hands of a sovereign God. We are not the masters of the world, but servants of the Creator. Nebuchadnezzar's fall makes us reflect on our own attitude. Often, when we reach a comfortable position, we can be tempted to forget God. But as we learned from the king, God can firmly and lovingly show us where our true dependence. During this time of humiliation, Nebuchadnezzar learned to look to God and recognize his authority. He was restored to his throne, but with a new heart, humbler, and with a clear vision of who truly reigns over all things. This experience of fall and redemption teaches us that pride can lead us to the abyss, but humility for God can restore us to true greatness. In 2 Chronicles 7:14, God promises, "If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land." Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation was a painful path, but he was restored because he turned to God with a sincere heart. And so, we can all learn the lesson that, even in the falls of life, there is always the possibility of redemption. The story of Nebuchadnezzar does not end here, but with a new beginning. And this leads us to reflect, how can God use our falls to take us to a place of greater faith and understanding? Let's move on to the next chapter and see what more we can learn from this journey. Don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. Lessons from history. After the fall and restoration of Nebuchadnezzar, he found himself transformed. His spiritual journey, marked by a meteoric rise, a devastating pride, and a humiliating fall, culminated in a profound reverence for God. The king, who once boasted of his own greatness, now recognized that his power and his empire were, in fact, gifts from God. He was not the master of the universe, but merely a servant of the Creator, and this revelation marked a crucial change in his life. Nebuchadnezzar shared his experience with others, publicly proclaiming the wonders of God. In Daniel 4:34-37, "And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, or say unto him, What dost thou?" The king, now transformed, shared with the world the lesson he had learned the hardest way. Pride leads to a fall, but humility before God brings true wisdom and glory. He recognized that no matter how powerful we are all dependent on God for our existence and success. This story, full of highs and lows, teaches us valuable lessons. The first and most obvious is about the danger of pride. Nebuchadnezzar, at his peak, believed that his greatness was the result of his own effort. However, as he learned the hard way, true greatness lies in recognizing God's sovereignty over our lives. He and all of us are merely instruments in God's hands. In James 4:6, we read, "But he gives more grace. Therefore," he says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Humility before God is what opens the doors to true wisdom and true honor. Second, this story teaches us that no matter how far we have fallen, there is always the possibility of redemption. Nebuchadnezzar was restored not because he deserved it, but because God, in his infinite grace, extended his hand to lift him up. Likewise, all of us, when we fall, can find mercy in God. In 1 John 1-9, we are reminded that If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is a testimony of God's grace, who lifts us when we fall and transforms us when we turn to him with a contrite heart. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar's story teaches us about the power of transformation. When we look at the king's life, we see a person who went from being an arrogant conqueror to a humble man of faith. And this transformation did not happen because of human power, but through divine intervention. Sometimes God needs to break us in order to rebuild us according to his purpose. He uses our difficulties and falls to shape us and prepare us for something greater. As Romans 8:28 reminds us, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. In every experience, God teaches us something new and guides us toward his will. Now that we have reflected on the lessons from Nebuchadnezzar's story, we can see how this journey is a metaphor for our own lives. Each of us has moments of rise and fall, but what really matters is what we do with those moments. Are we ready to recognize God's sovereignty, be transformed by his grace? As we follow this journey of faith, may we always remember that God is the true king over all the kingdoms of the earth. Let's continue our journey in search of more divine wisdom. Let's grow together in faith and wisdom.